Amen, amen. Awesome. Well, hey, we are going to finish up as we're saying goodbye to November. We're going to finish our journey through the layers of trust. We're going to answer the question today, can I trust again? After trust has been broken, can I trust again? Is it possible? Even if we can't trust someone who has really wronged us, we have to understand the experiences of those wrongs can still paint how we trust other relationships in our lives as well. Remember, trust is the essence of life and the foundation of relationship. See, it's hard to live life and have healthy relationships when our ability to trust others is somewhat broken. We can grow some weird tendencies in our lives if we have broken trust and issues kind of going on in our hearts. Could I ask you this morning, what is the hardest thing that you have ever had to do in life? What's the hardest thing? Just think about it, or just take a moment. What's the hardest thing that you have ever had to do in life? For me, I've had to do some hard things, but probably the hardest thing that I've had to do in life is this game. Oh my goodness, this thing is terrible, I'm telling you. One of these mazes, you get the little silver ball in there and you're like trying to get it through all the mazes and not fall into the holes and all that. It's hard. Like there are times when I want to smash this thing because it taunts me. It's like it's always telling me when I see it that you can't beat me. I own you. Like it tells me that, I swear. And then I grit my teeth, I try to beat it and I can't. It's a stupid game, I hate this thing, all right? All right, there's much harder things that I've had to do in life than trying to accomplish this game here, okay? And I'm sure that you have as well. But one of the most difficult things that I have found to be true in life, that is some of the hardest things that I've ever had to walk through is rebuilding trust. Can I get an amen for that? Amen. That's hard to do in life, isn't it? When somebody wrongs you or hurts you or causes you issues, it's hard to risk again, isn't it? When somebody ditches you or falsely accuses you or lies about you, it's hard to put your weight into that relationship again. Rebuilding our trust muscle in life is difficult. Actually, it's probably one of the hardest things that we ever have to do. Last week we talked about when somebody does you dirty, and that's the reality of life. We are all going to be wronged in life. So how do we deal with that? We as people, we want to be safe. We look for security and trusting other people. It can be a shaky business, can't it? Rebuilding trust can be a humbling process. In order to be free and to be healed of any damage that has been done by other people, you have to allow the Lord to really work in your heart and your life. And I'm not talking about just doing the thing, reading the Bible, praying, and coming to church. Like, that's all good. But, man, if we really want to rebuild some of that trust muscle in our lives, we actually have to ask God to help us in that area. That means that we sometimes have to face the pain. We got to face sometimes some false narratives or some wrongful expectations. You got to let God work. James 4:10 says, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Humility is always what invites God to work in your life. For trust to be rebuilt in our lives, we need gobs and gobs of humility. We need to make humility the position that we take in life. Because when we get wounded, often we tell ourselves, I will never hurt like that again, so I'm not going to trust again. Anybody? That hurt can actually lead us to try to find our own sense of security by ourselves. And that's where pride starts to come in. You see, rebuilding trust is impossible without humility. Because receiving grace is impossible without humbling yourself. Humility is actually what overturned the world. Let me explain that. See, Jesus' act on the cross redefined what greatness truly is. See, ancient Rome had nothing to do with humility. Humility was not even in Rome's vocabulary. Romans would pursue honor and avoid shame at all costs in life. But humility was not a virtue. I mean, they were as philosophers. They had all of these different essentials of life and virtues in life. Humility was not even a virtue. It didn't even come close to making the list. Humility to the Romans was associated with failure and shame. So when Christ came and he taught that you had to lose your life in order to really gain it, that you had to give your life up in order to gain it, that was a difficult thing for the world to understand because that's not how they understood things. It was all about how you come out on top. But then Christ, he did it for all the world to see, and he exemplified what that looks like so that, listen, trust and reconciliation could be rebuilt in our relationship with God. Now, it wasn't God's fault. He didn't break that trust. We did. But Jesus even covered that for us when we're the ones that messed it up. Humility in relationships allows you to be approachable. It allows you to show other people, listen, I don't got everything all together. I'm not high and mighty. I'm not above you in any way. Humility is an invitation for people. In 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa friend and guide, Terzen Norgay, conquered Mount Everest. Anybody ever climb Everest here? Just wondering. I mean, you never know. Be really cool. I'd give you a high five. But Hillary was knighted later on that year. In 1985, he was made New Zealand's highest commissioner to India, to Nepal, to Bangladesh. Later on, his face was actually put on currency in New Zealand before he even died. That was quite a thing. Yet he always seemed to remain humble. In 1960, he began the Himalayan Trust, where he developed it, and he would help the Nepali people with schools and hospitals and these types of things. Well, John Dixon, he shares a story about the humility of Sir Edmund Hillary. Visiting the Himalayas, Hillary was spotted by a group of tourist climbers who begged him for a photo. They recognized who he was. Hesitantly, he said yes, and they gave him an ice pick to kind of look the part because he wasn't really there to climb. As the picture was about to be taken, there was another climber that walked by and saw how Hillary was holding this ice pick. This climber kind of interrupted the picture. He said, "Excuse me, it's actually not how you hold an ice pick. Let me show you how." He's talking to the guy that was the first to conquer Mount Everest here, right? I mean, come on. Everyone awkwardly stood there quietly as Hillary thanked the man, let him adjust the ice pick, and happily went on to take the photograph. You see, no matter how great that climber may have been, he was kind of diminished by his presumption in that moment. He didn't realize that was who he was talking to, and yet he was talking to the expert. He was correcting the expert. But Hillary's greatness shone bright through his humility in that moment. See, humility will always speak softly, but it will communicate loudly. In order for you to rebuild trust in your life, humility is absolutely essential. A prideful person has no desire to really rebuild trust in life. But Christ calls us to humbly pursue peace in relationships. He calls us to love beyond our own capabilities. He calls us to forgive past our own anger and our own hurts. I just want you to imagine for a moment with me. Imagine you being betrayed by those closest to you, namely your family. Then imagine being forsaken, left for dead by those who you thought loved you. Imagine being then placed in a new environment completely foreign to you and having to work like crazy just to survive. Imagine being given greater responsibility because of your hard work, doing everything with integrity and even bringing success to your boss, only to be falsely accused of a heinous crime and then thrown into prison. Imagine working even harder in this new environment only to be rejected time and time again by those that you helped. That's the story of Joseph. After all Joseph went through, have you ever thought about this? How could he ever trust again? You see, sometimes we make these Bible figures, these superstars, and we take away their humanity. But just think about it. I mean, he went through the worst. How could he ever trust again? I mean, he was wronged time and time again. How could he have relationships that were healthy? How could he not be paranoid with people around him? Well, first, it starts with humility. Joseph definitely learned how to leave things up to God and walk humbly. But that didn't mean that he never struggled with any feelings of resentment or bitterness or blame or anything like that. At this point of his life, he was now second in charge over the most powerful nation of the world, Egypt. Life had a drastic shift for him, and he was now enjoying a life that he never thought he could have. He got married. He had 2 sons. God was using him mightily. His past was, his past. He didn't need to go back to those dark chapters of his life. That is until one day, the very people that caused him the greatest harm were standing right in front of him. Sure, they had aged a bit, but he recognized every single one of his brothers. And with seeing them, a flood of emotions, I can only imagine, just welled up on the inside. I bet you his heart stopped in that moment. Anger, sorrow, resentment, fear. Would they recognize him? Did they even believe he was still alive? That answer soon arrived when the reason they were in Egypt was revealed. They needed grain, because everybody needed grain. The famine was fierce in the land, and Egypt had the only storehouses around, thanks to Joseph. Well, thanks really to God that gave Joseph the answer to store up this grain for the future. But now these weasels would dare come to him for grain? They all but ended his life, and now they wanted something from him? Can you track with me through Joseph's feelings, I'm sure, that he was experiencing? Anybody? You know it. And so right before his eyes, we find this. And it says in Genesis 42, and Joseph recognized them, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. Talk about a terrible grocery aisle experience. You know what I'm talking? You're down at the Pyramid Produce and checking out the grain, all the different types of grain, right? And all of a sudden, you run into those peeps who did you dirty. Ever happened to you? You're in the grocery store walking down that aisle, and all of a sudden that guy or that lady turns into your aisle. You can't run, you can't hide, you can't pretend. But damn, man, they did some things. They said some things, and it's like, oh, right? For Joseph, it was a lifetime ago. Life was good now. Why did this happen? Like, why did they have to show up? Yeah, they couldn't physically do anything to Joseph anymore, but just seeing them just made Joseph's heart just die within him. And as for the dreams, at this point, Joseph just chalked them up over the years to, he thought maybe he just ate some bad date pizza the night before or something, right? But now these dreams from the Lord seem to be coming right back, smack dab in the middle of his life. What is going on here? And Joseph knew probably in this moment, after all these humbling experiences, God was most likely at work yet again in his life. But could Joseph follow God into this? Could he rebuild trust in his life? Was he just supposed to forget all about how they did him wrong? See, rebuilding trust starts with humility, and humility says, God, let your will be done, not mine. It says, you are God and I am not, so I'm going to allow your process to supersede my feelings. I'm not sure I can participate, but I'm still going to try. I'm going to trust you. That's what humility says. And that humility will lead to the next piece, whether they deserve it or not. In order for you to be free of your hurt and your pain, we talked about this a bit last week. We're going to talk about it a little bit more this week. Forgiveness, because forgiveness is God's way. God is the most hurt and rejected person in the entire universe. And his way for us was to make relationship work with us was through forgiveness. Forgiveness is more about cooperation than determination. See, God set his plan up for Joseph. Joseph wasn't looking to go back to those chapters in his life. And a side note real quick, God does not always allow people from the past to come in who have done you dirty and wrong. And that's not always God's plan, that everything's going to be perfect and good and right afterwards. There are some things and there's some people that God will save us from because of what they did do in past seasons of life. God's not necessarily calling you to rebuild relationship with everybody. But as I said before, rebuilding trust, because we have to trust people, even those people that didn't do us wrong. And when we don't allow God's healing to take place in our lives, we have a tendency to project those trust issues into other relationships. There have been people that have taken from you far too much. The damage is done. But God gives you the ability to move forward. He gives you the power to forgive. Because forgiveness is not a feeling. I want you to hear me. Forgiveness is a weapon. It kills bitterness. It kills resentment. It kills all of that junk that tries to take over your heart. But you can't forgive based on your own determination and willpower. I think we try this far too often and we fail at it because we're trying to forgive in our own effort rather than leaning on Christ. Forgiveness has to start at the cross. When you forgive, you lean first on Jesus' act of forgiveness and what he has done rather than your own determination to forgive, because here's what I found. Forgiveness can be a work, an effort of self-righteousness. Because we all know that we're supposed to forgive, don't we? We know that's what God wants us to do. And so we feel obligated to have to do that, yet we're not feeling like we want to forgive. Listen, it's only by God's grace that you can forgive and do what the writer of Hebrews actually tells us to do. He says, strive for peace with everybody and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. You see, when we cooperate with God's forgiveness at the cross and apply that to those in our lives, we're destroying any roots of bitterness that would want to perpetuate in our lives. Roots of bitterness are very real, and they don't just stay in your heart with you. They creep out, and they start to defile other people and other relationships. They take your issues, your wounds, and your hurts and your pains, and they project them into others. That's how a root of bitterness works. And a root of bitterness will try to touch and affect other people. Try to grab a hold of other people, and that's not okay. That's why we apply the grace of God, not just to ourselves, but into our relationships as well. In 1966, there was two men that were shot and killed. Two men shot and killed 3 guys in the Lafayette Grill in Paterson, New Jersey. Just walked in, took out these guys. Reuben Hurricane Carter, an amazing boxer, along with a friend of his, were falsely convicted of murder in a highly publicized and racially charged trial because of the color of his skin. He maintained his innocence, but he was placed in jail and served for 19 years until his release and the overturn of his conviction. I mean, can you imagine that kind of injustice? Carter would go on to say, the question invariably always arises to me. It has before and it will again. Reuben, are you bitter? And in answer to that, I will say, after all that's been said and done, the fact that the most productive years of my life between the ages of 29 and 50 have been stolen, the fact that I was deprived of seeing my children grow up, wouldn't you think that I have the right to be bitter? Wouldn't anybody under those circumstances have a right to be bitter? In fact, it would be very easy to be bitter, but that has never been my nature or my lot to do the easy way. If I have learned nothing else in my life, I've learned that bitterness only consumes the vessel that contains it. And for me to permit bitterness to control or to infect my life in any way whatsoever would be to allow those who imprison me to take even more than these plus 20 years that they've already taken. Now that would make me an accomplice to their crime. What a perspective. What a perspective that he refused bitterness. Because bitterness holds you in a cell, and you start to join in it, with it, and all the wrong that's been done to you. And it just starts to snowball. And when bitterness lives in your heart, it doesn't just stay there. It affects everybody around you, defiles other people. It's an invasive weed that spreads strife and malice. It destroys peace within relationships. Unhealed pain can cause unchecked bitterness. And this is something that I've found to be true in my life. The pain that you feed will cause your pain to lead. I'll say that again. The pain that you feed will cause your pain to lead. It's true. The pain that you feed in your life will cause that same pain to lead your life. So no longer can you see with eyes of hope and eagerness anymore. Now that pain of what happened to you prevents you from believing your future can be better than your past. That pain convinces you that you're not good enough, or that it's God's judgment for your life and that you don't have any purpose in life. We then can place our unhealed pain onto others, maybe our spouse or our kids or our friends, a brother or a sister in Jesus Christ. The only way to heal that pain is forgiveness. Just like the only way to heal a broken arm is to reset it and put it in a cast, the only way to heal that kind of pain is forgiveness. Even if a relationship cannot be fully restored, forgiveness is still something that you need for your soul. Can I get an amen? See, forgiveness is a trade-off. You have to give up your right to demand that that person who hurt you should receive punishment. God will take care of that judgment whether you see it or not. But you got to give that up to go up. You give up that demand, that right, and guess what you receive in return? You get the freedom to move beyond the pit that person dragged you into. You get to move on from the prison cell of bitterness in your life and not be tied to that person any longer in that way. You get to experience the joy and the peace and the love of Jesus if you surrender in that way to him, rather than all of the icky feelings and all the negative thoughts that are tied to those words, to that season, to that wound or to that person. Rebuilding trust in your life is a process. It's not a momentary decision. It's a daily decision. It's a battle between our human nature and our spiritual nature. And as for Joseph, he wasn't going to reveal who he was yet to his bros. No, not quite yet. There needed to be a little bit more before he decided that he could actually share who he was. Besides, his younger brother, he wasn't with them. And everything in Joseph wanted to see his younger brother. So Joseph decided to send them back with grain, but also with some conditions. We find in Genesis 42, in verse 21, they said to one another, because they were kind of now going through this experience where Joseph is saying, I'll send you back, but you got to leave one of your brothers here, because I don't trust that you're not a spy. See, you knew who they were, but they didn't know who he was. And he wanted to test this out for a little bit. And so they turned to one another and they started conversing. They said, in truth, we're guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress right now is coming upon us. And Reuben, the oldest, answered, I told you, did I not tell you? Always the oldest. I told you, right? Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. And they did not know that Joseph could understand them, for there was an interpreter between them. And he turned away from them and he wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them. And he took Simeon from them, bound him before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to replace every man's money in a sack, and to give them provisions for the journey ahead. This was all done for them. You see, Joseph was battling back and forth here. All the hurt, all the desire to see his brother, his father, all the justice that he could have enacted with his own very hands against his brothers in that moment. But Joseph concocted this little plan. He gave them grain, but hid all their money right back in their sacks. He also required that Simeon would stay as, they wanted to make sure they weren't spies, returning with so they had to return with this younger brother wanted to make sure he wasn't this imaginary person. See, sometimes when we are faced with the opportunity to rebuild trust in a relationship, we actually entertain games. We do things that are not quite right because we're still hurting. So we might, say something that we shouldn't say. We might do something that we shouldn't do. Here's the thing, unhealed pain that consumes your soul will control your actions. You've got to be careful of the 3 V's: vengeance, vindictiveness, and validation. Vengeance is payback. It's trying to inflict some kind of harm on another because of the hurt that you're carrying. Vindictiveness is spite. A vindictive person will look for opportunities for resentment. Vindictiveness has a hard time of letting go. Anyone who they think is competing against them, they deem a threat. A vindictive person will give backhanded compliments in a way to cover up their own envy, or they'll sabotage, they press buttons, they criticize behind your back, or you do it to others. Vindictiveness is often rooted in insecurity. But then there's the last V, and it's called validation. You see, unhealed pain that consumes you will control you in a way that you have to now prove yourself to people. You obsess over what others think about you, and you begin to live in a way that tries to gain other people's recognition. That unhealed pain will begin to form a huge log in your own eye as you see all the specks in everybody else's eyes. John wrote in his 3rd epistle to the church, "Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil or seeks vengeance or vindictiveness or tries to validate self, that's evil. They've not seen God." See, good doesn't just happen We have to imitate it in our lives because often our carnal nature, that old man, that flesh, will choose evil. Imitating good is not lashing out. It's speaking honorably even when you've been dishonored. It's giving even when you've been taken from. It's walking 2 miles when all you had to walk was 1. Joseph was back and forth in this battle. That is until he saw his older brothers again. But this time, his younger brother was with them. And it says when he saw his younger brother, that Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber, and he wept there. Then he washed his face, and he came out, controlling himself. He said, "Serve the food." You see, in this moment, when he had heard that the brothers came back, he had sent his stewards out to invite him to his actual house where he was going to set up a feast for him because he knew that his younger brother was going to be there. And he was super, super touched. His heart was filled with warmth just seeing his younger brother Benjamin. Who knows what would have happened if they had not brought this younger brother with them. But seeing him, Joseph, his heart softened. He was able to continue to move along with God's process of rebuilding trust. So much so that he prepared a feast for them. He didn't yet reveal who he was, but he initiated in good faith on his part to see if he could even handle these next steps. Lysa TerKeurst writes in her book, Forgiving What You Can't Forget, that while we are affected by other people's actions, we're not held accountable for their actions. So we have to make sure to be honest about the effect somebody else is having on us. She writes, forgiveness releases our need for retaliation, not our need for boundaries. Healthy expectations will need to be reset in the rebuilding trust process. Boundaries are a necessary part of a relationship in life. Jesus taught us to pray that we would be forgiven our trespasses as we forgive those that have trespassed against us. In life, we get trespassed upon. People come over the property line of our life and they trespass on our lives. Boundaries are necessary. It's not bad to have boundaries and to have expectations that are healthy and good and godly. But what's interesting with Joseph is that he didn't sit with his brothers in this feast. He actually sat separate from them because the story tells us that the Egyptians refused to sit with shepherds. It was loathsome to them. So there was somewhat of a boundary already there culturally that everybody in that room understood. But here's what Joseph did not do. He didn't sit down with them, breaking any sense of boundary that he needed to maintain. You see, a lot of times we might set boundaries in our lives, but then we're the ones that allow them to get broken all the time. If you're rebuilding trust with somebody in your life, it's okay to have healthy expectations. It's okay to have boundaries. It's okay to think about what you really need in that relationship. It's healthy for you, and it's actually healthy for other people. It helps you be protected, and it helps them to know that you're not going to be manipulated or hurt or lied to, or that wrong was harmful to you. It's okay for you to refuse that kind of treatment in your life. Scripture tells us to speak the truth in love. Trust is measured by truth, and it's covered with love. I want to say that again. Trust is measured by truth and covered with love. They're both essentials to trust. And oftentimes we can either be on the truth aspect of things, and often truth with very little bit of love, that just nixes any type of relational bonds. But over on the other side is love, and sometimes love can just cover over the truth. So much so that you're enabling the other person to continue in certain ways of their lives. Trust needs both truth and love. It's measured by truth, but it's covered in love. If those cannot be actualized in a relationship, those feelings of trust and those actions of trust will not be prevalent. When somebody says to you, just trust me, we talked about that, or expects that you can just trust them after they caused you harm, then it's time to speak the truth in love and communicate those healthy boundaries. Joseph wasn't fully convinced yet. He was still holding on to some pain, and rightfully so. He was going to have one more test to see if he'd be able to reveal himself to them. And the brothers, they had this happy feast. It was wonderful. Still didn't know about Joseph. They received their grain. They were on their way home. But Joseph had done something. He placed all their money in their sacks again. But this time he also had his steward put his silver cup in Benjamin, the youngest brother's bag. Long story short, he sent his men after them, accused them of stealing. Whoever had this cup in their bag, they were going to be staying in jail. He demanded that Benjamin stayed in jail because that was who it was. And at hearing this, his brothers knew what would happen to their father if Benjamin did not return home with them. So Judah, he spoke up. He said, now therefore, please let your servant remain. Let me stay instead of this boy as a servant to my Lord, and let this boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. He knew that losing another son would do his father in. And more than that, he gave himself for his younger brother. And this is what Joseph needed to hear. Because all the while, Joseph is wondering, have my brothers changed? Have they changed at all in life? Are they still the same people of whom I knew them in? Am I looking at old people in their new selves? Or am I looking at the new version of them? Have they changed at all? Would they think only of themselves, or were they actually thinking of their father whom they already grieved and covered up their wrong doing to? Rebuilding trust, listening for the evidence of genuine change is essential in rebuilding trust. There's no quick fixes. There's no sweeping things under the rug. There's no relationship without being responsible and accountable for the wrongs that have been done. It's like this game, this maze game. There's a lot of pits, a lot of possibilities, a lot of tensions to manage, feelings to bring before Jesus, mazes to go through, but rebuilding trust in relationships is possible. And for Joseph, the dam broke. Genesis 45, verse 1 says, and Joseph could not control himself anymore before all those that stood before him. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. They were probably like pooping their pants or something. You know what I mean? Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near, and he said, I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Oh my goodness, Joseph's perspective. Can anybody say awkward? I mean, it's great to see you, Joe. You're gonna throw me in jail now, right? Are you gonna take my life from me? I mean, they all thought he was dead. But now he's the guy, like the top of the top. Joseph had worked through this forgiveness in his heart. He's assessing if trust can be rebuilt. And now he reveals himself and he's willing to reconcile. Joseph spent the time to assess his brother's character. Had they changed? Were they remorseful? Were they repentant? Were they blaming or defensive? Were they making excuses? Vulnerability is always necessary risk in relationship. If the other person is going to continue to blame or unwilling to acknowledge any wrongs being done that they've done, if they're just going to blame shift and gaslight, then guess what? They're not ready, and you don't need to put yourself in that position. Don't put yourself out there because they're not ready to walk through what it looks like to rebuild trust. But as for you, vulnerability is still key. You don't have to share everything with that person or give yourself to somebody who has wronged you or is hurting you, but you still have to be vulnerable so you're not entertaining resentment in your own heart. You have to be vulnerable with yourself. You have to ask yourself some different questions. Who do I want to be? Do I want to let the wrong that they have done to me affect me so much that it changes me to be somebody that I am not? Who do I want to be? What kind of character am I growing, even in the hurts that have been done to me? Am I acting or reacting like Jesus? What kind of boundaries and expectations do I have to create for this relationship or for other relationships? Am I experiencing freedom in this relationship? Can I communicate clearly without the fear of some kind of misunderstanding or being punished because I'm trying to be vulnerable and honest in terms of how this affected me? Is the relationship life-giving or am I being diminished by it? These questions really help us to understand and process our thoughts and our feelings as we are trying to build back trust. Also, if another person is unwilling to put Christ at the center of things, but rather put themselves or their offense or their issues first, then it's going to be very hard to rebuild trust. The reality is we're all people and we all make mistakes. All people have the propensity to have some bad stuff going on in our hearts, but Christ calls us away from that. And he calls us to a higher road, a narrow road, a road that's much more difficult to walk upon, a road that's not crowded like the wide road that the world is walking on. It's not an easy road. It's a higher road for a reason. And that pertains even to the relationships of how we respond and how we relate to other people. Even for Joseph and his brothers, things don't just stop with a big group family hug in that moment. It wasn't like, oh, everybody's hugging and everybody's good and life is great. Oh my goodness, pat on the back, you know. Joe, it's good to see you. Boys, it's good to see you too. That's not what happened. Soon after, we find that Jacob, or Israel, his name was changed. Joseph's father was brought back to Egypt, all the family with him. Things were pretty good. They were living life kind of under the comforts of Joseph. But eventually Israel died. And now the brothers were concerned that Joseph would repay them for all they did to him. So the brothers made up a little story saying that Dad told us to tell you. Isn't that funny how that works? Dad didn't tell Joseph, but Dad told the brothers, right? Dad told us to tell you, Joseph, that you got to forgive us for all those wrongs. See how that works? You know, they're still not taking all that responsibility. They're still trying to eke through this thing. It's kind of juvenile. When we don't allow God to work in the process, we can make some childish schemes. But look at how Joseph responded in Genesis 50. It says, but Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? And I would ask you that real quickly before I continue on. Are you in the place of God? Does that harm, does that pain, does that offense put you in the place of God? As for you, Joseph said, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I'll provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Can you just believe the character of Joseph? These brothers that did so many unkind things to him, his life, his heart had been so changed by God's working in him, by God's humble process, by the way of God in his life, that he could give kindness even to these brothers that are still kind of doing some juvenile things. Rebuilding trust is all about taking baby steps. In fact, it's more like a drop of water a day in many cases to fill a gallon container. That there needs to be some proof in the pudding of rebuilding trust. Listen, trust, it can be earned back. You can forgive a person, and we need to forgive no matter what. But trust, it has to be built back. And here's what I know. Our small pursuits of peace can reveal God's big purpose of redemption. This whole process of Joseph's life was monumental. He was not only facing those who essentially said, "You're dead to us," he forgave them. He trusted God, and he rebuilt his ability to trust again. But beyond that, Joseph's story leads us to the greatest redemption story of all mankind. If Joseph had chosen differently, the line of the Messiah would have been snuffed out, and that greater redemptive story of Jesus coming to the cross, because it came through the line of Israel, would have been stopped. God has greater plans for your personal forgiveness than you might know. And Peter instructs us this way: finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil, reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, flip that script, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days. Do you want to love life? Do you want to see good days? Then keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. You know what I try to do when trust is broken in my life? When my heart gets wounded? I try to do as much good as I possibly can. Maybe not right away with the person or the persons who've wounded me or broken my trust. But I've learned that my response needs to not be evil, but to do good. As far as I am able to do good. And listen, I've been in ministry now for 20 years. My whole adult life. And I say this to say that I'm kind of in the people business. I've had a front row view, a front row seat of many relationships and conflicts in relationships. I've seen God work mightily in relationships. I've seen the enemy cause strife in relationships. I've seen it all. And through it all, even as a pastor, and I've experienced a lot too. I've been a scapegoat for people. I've been rejected. I've given and given and given only to be returned with grief and loss. I've been misconstrued, misunderstood. I've been slandered, gossiped about. I've been looked at with a suspicious eye. I've been lied about. I've been blamed. I've been stabbed in the back more times than you could count. And I say this not to throw this victim card out there. That's not it at all. I'm just saying I know the pain. And I experience the pain quite a lot. But the only way through is to trust God and to do good. You're not called to evil. You are not called to revile. You're not called to do the same things that have been done to you. You're called to be a blessing beyond that season of pain. You're called to walk in humility with God in His ways, not the ways of the world. You're called to love even in the midst of hate. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, hate is too great a burden to bear. You are called to seek peace and pursue it. You're called to look and sound like Jesus in a world that doesn't understand Jesus. You're called to do good even in the face of evil. Trusting God and trusting His process will give you the greatest freedom that there is, and that is the freedom to move beyond. Jesus didn't get all warped up in a victim mentality. He decided on a victory mentality, and He said, I'm going to overcome the bitterness. I'm going to overcome the resentment, the unforgiveness. I'm going to overcome the pain and the wounds and the hurts. All of that, I'm going to overcome that in my life because I want the freedom of God in my life to live a life before the Lord. I want to live a life that I see good in my days, where it's not filled with deceit and talk of evil. I'm not going to allow my mouth to speak that. I'm going to move beyond because God's got more for me. So who here wants to move beyond that season of hurt and pain in your life? I do. It's a process, as we've talked about today. It's not just some moment, but by God's grace, you can move beyond. You can be moved beyond into the freedom that Christ offers you. So if you want to move beyond, if you just lifted up your hand, I just want to ask that you'd stand to your feet right now. I want to pray for you specifically and ask for God's grace and His freedom in your life in that way. Jesus, you can sympathize with our weaknesses, our responses. You can sympathize, God, with our hurts, our fears, our trust issues. You can sympathize with us all. God, I can't imagine some of the wrongs and some of the hurts and some of the things that have been done. These precious people who you love so much. But you know what they've walked through. You know where they're coming from. You understand them. And Jesus, we would just simply ask today that as we choose forgiveness, as we choose humility, as we choose to trust and to rebuild trust, as we choose to be vulnerable, as we choose wise boundaries and healthy expectations, we trust that you're guiding that process in our lives. And right now we're surrendering to you. And we're asking God in this surrender of all that stuff, God, that you would bring us your freedom and a freedom to move beyond that season, that chapter, that pain, that hurt in our lives. And God, we invite you to heal our hearts, heal our minds, heal our relationships, oh God. Help us to be a people that pursue peace, that give grace, that wage war on any roots of bitterness. Will not allow those things to perpetuate in our hearts and in our relationships. God, we invite you to do that as we surrender ourselves to you here in this place. As the worship team leads us, let's just continue to surrender to the Lord. We're also going to open up the altar for anybody that might need some prayer, and I think there's a few people that might. It might not be directly related to what was talked about this morning, but if you need prayer for anything, health issue, maybe there's some worry about the future, maybe you're struggling in a relationship, I don't know. We want to pray with you here this morning, so we invite you to do that. But let's take this moment just to minister unto the Lord. Can we just lift our hands to him right now and just surrender to him in this moment?